Hello, friends. This is Mike Williams of the Sage Aquay Radio Hour. I recently had the pleasure of joining Mark Devlin on Cara St. Lewis's Hard True podcast. This is hour 2 of the conversation with Cara. In part 1, Mark and I explained how the music industry is a social engineering tool, and in hour 2, which is this segment, we discussed the replacement of Paul McCartney back in 1966. Links to the first hour with Cara, along with links to our respective websites and media, are listed in the description box below. Thanks for listening.
Hello, everybody. Now, welcome to the second hour of my interview with Mike Williams and Mark Devlin. And this is really special because now we're going to hone in on everybody's favorite topic, which is the Beatles. Okay. We can't not do it because it is such a huge part of our psyche. It is a huge part of our psyche. These 4 people who turned the world upside down. Yeah. So what I'm going to ask Mark and Mike to do is sort of remind us about the inception of the Beatles, take us up to 1966, and then they have so much to say about their evidence that it's really not even a question anymore as to whether or not Paul McCartney is actually Paul McCartney. So, guys, who wants to take us to the beginning of the Beatles?
Well, I can start it if you will. Is that okay, Mark?
Yeah, sure.
Just a real quick overview, Cara. As we know, the Beatles hit the scene in 1963. They started as essentially just a rock and roll band playing in England. Also spent a lot of time in Germany. Then they were discovered, if you will, by Brian Epstein. And Brian Epstein owned a small record store, and he took an interest in the Beatles. And he then proceeded to try to get the Beatles signed to a major label. The first label they went to, Decca, turned them down, allegedly, and then they wound up with EMI. From there, the Beatles, their first couple of albums, they came out with songs. Some of the songs were Lennon and McCartney compositions, but they did a lot of cover music. And as their albums progressed, they got more and more away from, in fact, they got completely away from cover music, and then the compositions on the albums were all Lennon and McCartney for all intents and purposes. Then Epstein died when he was 32 years old, right before his 33rd birthday. We'd maybe talk about that a little bit. And it was very interesting after Brian Epstein died. That's pretty much when a lot of things, in my view, started to change for the Beatles. And of course, then the whole Paul is dead conspiracy kicked in, where the biological Paul McCartney, allegedly died based upon researchers that are looking into this. In 1966, the dates vary. Some will say September 11th, 1966. Some will say November 11th. And then we have some researchers that will say that the date was even prior to September, that it was, they believe it might have been August. And then when that happened, after the Revolver album, Sgt. Pepper was released, and then we got a completely new view of the Beatles, optically, the way they looked, the visual aspects of it, and also the music. It was really now an introduction into the psychedelic era. And then, of course, the Beatles broke up. The last album to be released was Let It Be, during the Let It Be sessions, and that was released in 1970. So from the standpoint of the Beatles, their tenure on a timeline, we can say from 1963 to 1970. So it was only 7 years.
Right.
So in that 7 years, if we take a look at what the Beatles, what their influence was on a societal level, on a cultural level, it was absolutely stunning when we think about it. So McCartney, or the person playing Paul McCartney, played a big part in The Summer of Love, in the Monterey concert. That involved the CIA for sure. And it was really the introduction of LSD at that point. And he played a part in that, according to the book, The Memoirs of Billy Shears. And we can get into that a little bit so people can understand what that book is about. But the point being is that at the end of the day, the Beatles were a huge influence on society, the way people dress, the way people look, the advent of people picking up a guitar and wanting to be in a band, wanting to be a rock star, wanting to be like the Beatles, and so on. And if you take a look today at many of the bands that are in place, they will tell you that a major influence was the Beatles. Many, many bands will still say this, and for all intents and purposes, the Beatles haven't been around in 47 years, since 1970, yet their influence still runs very, very high. So, tremendously influential in the music scene, in entertainment, and in our society and our culture.
Yes, you can't underestimate their impact, can you?
No.
Yeah. Mark?
Well, yeah, let me just add to that by referring back to my earlier comment about how cultural creation gets done and how lifetime actors are used. A lifetime actor, by the way, it's a phrase that was coined by the author and researcher Joseph Atwill, who wrote the book Caesar's Messiah and many others. And it was invented to convey the idea of somebody that is put out there in the public eye, and they're given a profile and they're thought of as one thing, whether it's a rock star, whether it's a Hollywood actor or a television presenter or a sports star or a politician, anyone that everyone has heard of that has become a household name. But when you do the digging into their background and their affiliations and their associations, you come to discover that they're actually playing a role, this lifetime actor role, and they're put out there to, again, change culture, change societal values. That's what a lifetime actor is. So when I first started looking into all this stuff and this whole subject area, I came to understand that any fad, any trend, any movement which affects the perceptions and the belief systems and the consciousness of large numbers of people has been placed there on purpose, because these things don't happen by accident. So when you look at the cultural impact that the Beatles had and the billions of people around the world that have become familiar with their music and have become fans of everything that they've stood for, there's no way that would have been allowed to have progressed organically and to have just evolved by itself. They have to have been the creation of these agencies that make all this stuff happen.
Right.
And the same thing can be said of the Rolling Stones, who of course were the Beatles' main rivals, and they were pitted as the kind of antithesis to the Beatles. So when the Beatles first came out, as Mike said, they were very clean cut, they were very kind of full of wholesome values, and they were a nice kind of group that your mum would like and your auntie would like. This is before the big switch in their music around about 1966, when everything went psychedelic and a bit weird and a bit experimental. But when they first came out, that's what they were all about. Whereas the Rolling Stones were always marketed as a rougher, edgier version of the Beatles. So if the Beatles were a bit too squeaky clean for you, then you had the Rolling Stones. But the point is, both these groups were created, both these groups were controlled, and in actual fact, they were all good friends. So the Beatles used to hang out with the Rolling Stones. They would go to each other's houses and do drugs together. And there was this guy, Andrew Loog Oldham, who was a manager of both bands. He hopped over from the Beatles to the Rolling Stones. So they weren't really rivals at all. They were working for the same side, as were many other groups at that time. And it just would not have been left to chance that they became the massive phenomenon that they did. You know, so often it's easier to explain a situation and to convey what it's all about by stating what it isn't. So you state it in the apophatic. So, for instance, when it comes to 9/11, there's so much disagreement among alternative researchers as to what really happened that day. Were we looking at exotic directed energy weapons? Were the planes holograms, etc.? But the one thing we can all agree on is that it didn't happen the way we were told it did by the mainstream media. So whatever it was, wasn't 19 Arab hijackers with box cutters. When it comes to Paul McCartney, there's all kinds of opinions and conjecture and speculation over whether he actually died. Of course, there's this whole Paul is dead research community, which will insist that the original Paul died, but we don't actually have any documented proof that he died. We have lots of symbolic clues. We have lots of things that kind of hint at the fact that he did, but we don't know for definite that Paul died in 1966. That's the kind of conventional narrative in all of this. We don't really know who the individual that is playing the part of McCartney is, although there's strong clues in that area as well. But the one thing that we can be sure of, as far as I'm concerned, is that the individual today claiming to be Paul McCartney is not the original biological James Paul McCartney. So as far as I'm concerned, you start from there. And really, I refer to this whole thing as not PID, but PAP, which is Paul ain't Paul.
Paul ain't Paul.
So
okay.
You can go a long way by stating what isn't the case. And what isn't the case is that this guy is not Paul McCartney.
Yeah, I have to say I have an advantage, maybe on some of the listeners right now, because I have heard some of the arguments that you guys have made within the last year or so. I have to say I agree with you. I don't know that it hasn't been proved, Mark, but hey, you're a clean researcher, and you have to say, look, it is what it is right now, and I can't say for sure. So, okay, so let's start at 1966 then. Possibly September 11th, maybe August. I don't know. What happened?
So the story goes that he left the studio that evening, and he got into his car, and he had a tiff. Now, some researchers will say that the argument he had was with John Lennon, and others will say that no, Lennon was in Paris. He had an argument with Brian Epstein over song allocations for the next album. So I guess perhaps he was annoyed that he had to write so many songs in X period of time, and so that kind of bothered him. So he got in the car. It was bad weather. It was raining, and he picked up a hitchhiker along the way. And then there was a car accident, and it was a very, very bad car accident. And the way the story goes is that he was decapitated. September 11th is the date that is assigned. It's primarily, and I should be fair about this, it's assigned by the book, The Memoirs of Billy Shears, which is a very interesting book because even though the author is Tom Harriet, the book is in the first person, and the first person who's telling you the story is a person who claims that his name is William Wallace Shepard, or Bill Shepard. And he claims to be the guy that's been playing Paul McCartney for the last 50 years. Yeah. He's the one that has the main contract. So that's the story. And what then happened was they had to come up with a replacement. And why they had to come up with a replacement, well, those stories kind of vary also. Some will say that they did it because the Beatles were so important to so many young people that to come out and talk about the loss of Paul McCartney would just be devastating to the fan base. And of course, the other side, maybe the more cynical part of it, which is more where I'm leaning, is that, well, they did it for a reason because it was going to be a new phase of what the Beatles were going to bring to the table.
Yeah, but let me just interject really quickly. Mark, you probably heard Thomas Sheridan say this, but it's in point of fact, decapitation causes a mass hysterical hallucinogenic effect in anybody who sees it. So I see that as symbolic because what happened between one bit of that music and the next? The first was the clean cut music, and the second part was the psychedelic music. Yeah. And you've got symbolically, you've got a decapitation in there. Yeah. Yeah. Anyway, go ahead.
No, so then we had the introduction of this new guy into the band. He had undergone plastic surgery, and actually I refer to it more as reconstructive surgery. And this is why Epstein had come out, because Epstein actually died in 1967. Before I had said when he died, and then Sergeant Pepper. But what I meant to say, when I mentioned Epstein before, was his death to me denoted a major turning point in the whole Beatle construct and where they were going. But in any case, so this new guy had to undergo these surgeries. He claims in the book that it included fillers and also the use of latex. And this is why Epstein had come out and said, well, the Beatles are not going to tour anymore. Right? They're not going to be playing live anymore because the music is not growing. It's getting lost in the sauce. They can't hear themselves into playing on the stage. They want to devote more time into the studio so they could be more creative and imaginative and turn out bigger and better music, right? So that was pretty convenient when you think about it. And then there was a whole process of getting the public and the masses to get them oriented to the new guy. And the way they did that, Cara, in my opinion, and I'm sure Mark will agree, is the whole introduction of Sgt. Pepper itself, the whole album cover, the way the Beatles looked, the way they dressed, the longer hair, mustaches, beards, very, very different than what the Beatles looked like if you went back to the Revolver album or you went back to the Rubber Soul album. I mean, this is a completely different look. So what they did, what Tavistock did was, in British intelligence, is they didn't just work on him to make him look more like biological Paul with the surgeries. What they did was they changed everybody by changing the entire look of the band.
Oh, yeah.
You see?
Mm-hmm.
right? So Lennon comes out, he's got his granny glasses on, his hair is longer, he's got the beard and the mustache, and the whole band, the whole thing changed. And so what happened was when you looked at it as a Beatle fan, you were taken back by it. It was like, wow, look at this. This is unbelievable. Look at the Beatles. Look at how much the Beatles have changed. The Beatles have grown up. Look at them now.
Yeah.
See, so that little tactic, what it does is it really sets the focus and the attention. It takes it away from that one guy.
Yeah.
And it spreads it out, and it makes you look at everything. I mean, even looking at the album cover itself and all the people that were standing behind the Beatles, and it was a funeral scene. You're just taking all that in, and it's almost sensory overload at that point. You see?
Right.
And you're thinking, well, John looks different. Yeah, that's Ringo, but look at the way Ringo looks and George. And so when you look at Paul and you think to yourself, well, wow, he looks different too, but so does everything else.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And that was, in my view, a way for them to get over that hurdle. Yeah. And once they realized that they were able to get over that hurdle, then it was just full steam ahead.
Now, had they just been to India, or was that later?
That was later.
That was later. Okay. So this is a good place, though, Mark and Mike, to interject what Mark's point was about this magician that we were just talking about and his experiments, and how much do people actually notice? Do you can you use that analogy for me here on in this bit?
This ties in with what Mike was just saying about the changing appearance of the Beatles on the Sgt. Pepper album, because I think to a certain extent, the human mind fills in blanks where it finds them. I know a psychologist or an anthropologist could explain it better, but people were so used to seeing the four Beatles together that when you see John, George, and Ringo, your mind automatically expects to see Paul right there in the fourth place. And it's not really going to scrutinize his features too much when it just expects to see Paul there. It's going to go, oh, there's Paul. So I think this is how they were able to get it past so many people in those early days, because nobody was expecting this switch, this psyop to be foisted on them.
Right.
But this does tie into this sequence from the illusionist Darren Brown, which appeared on his Channel 4 TV show a few years ago. And I've mentioned this in some of my public talks to help make the point about the replacement of Paul. So he's doing this experiment, and he's out in the street in London, and he's stopping passers-by. He's got a big map of London with him. He's stopping passers-by and asking them if they can give him directions to this particular address. So he starts off with this girl, and he says, oh, excuse me, I'm trying to find this address. And she starts looking at the map, and she's saying, oh, you go here and you turn left here. And while she's chatting to him, he's got a couple of accomplices who are carrying a great big painting. They're coming out of this building. And they come between the two of them. They say, excuse me, coming through. And while the girl's not looking, Darren Brown very niftily jumps behind the painting, and he swaps places with one of the guys that was carrying it. And one of the guys that was carrying it has a map, identical to Darren Brown's map, and he then jumps into his place. And when the girl looks up from her map, she hasn't noticed that it's no longer Darren Brown that she's talking to, but a different guy altogether. And he tries this same trick with 2 or 3 other people. And in each case, he swaps with somebody that looks less and less like him, to the point that the last time he does it, he swaps with a woman. And the person that he's speaking to for the directions looks up and doesn't twig that they're now speaking to a woman, whereas before they were speaking to a man. And there's a couple of very interesting things that he says at the end of this sequence. He says, first of all, one of the addresses that he's asking for directions to is St. Paul's Cathedral. Mm-hmm. Could that be a little clue? And the other thing that he says is, I'm sure that wouldn't have worked so well if I was, for instance, a world-famous rock star. And this, to me, hints at some kind of inside knowledge on the part of Darren Brown as to the switch that took place with McCartney. And it wouldn't surprise me at all if Darren Brown is working for MI6 purely because of his prominent role out there in culture and the fact that he's a mind control expert and he's an occultist and he's right there in the public eye. I think he's doing a work behind the scenes. But that, to me, was a very revealing sketch on his show.
Very revealing about people and how they operate. Exactly. And I think it's important that we know that. And I think one of the guys he switched with was a black man.
I believe it was, yeah.
For God's sake. And the person had just, she didn't snap that. Anyway,
The person is expecting to see the same guy there that she started talking to. Why would she expect any different?
Mm-hmm.
So for Beatles fans in the 1960s, why would they expect anything other than Paul standing there with the others? It wasn't until some years later that this whole theory gained a lot of prominence. Well, first of all, it was 1969, 2 years on from Sgt. Pepper. But it's only in relatively recent times that large numbers of us are now looking into this whole McCartney replacement thing.
Before we launch into this book, and I really do want to launch into this book because it sounds amazing, and you got so much material to discuss from both of you having read it and analyzed it and thought about it. Do you know the game that people have been playing for decades now? Which is your favorite Beatle? And each one of those Beatles represents a different part of the human being. Yeah? Ringo's the body. George is the soul. Paul is the heart. John is the mind or the brain. Yes? What does knowing that Paul McCartney isn't Paul? I mean, how does this isn't that an interesting game that we play with them, right? And B, what does this mean? What does this do to that kind of a game? What does this mean? Is the heart miss? I mean, do you know what I mean? Do you want to think about that? That's kind of a loaded, tricky question to put out there. But I mean, it really, to me, I thought, well, what does it do to that kind of thinking about this group?
Well, I don't think it does too much for most people because many people do not believe that he was replaced, right? So they still carry on.
What does it do if you're a Mason, though, in charge of the project? What does it say? Do you know what I mean? If you remove the heart, you remove the heart from, is the heart false?
I don't know. I don't know what that means from a Masonic perspective. I can tell you, though, that going back to the numbers for a second, that McCartney and Shepherd are all about the number 6. So the number 6, in the way the Masons use the number 6 from a magic perspective, it has to do with fooling, tricking, or deceiving. It's hexcraft, right? So the whole McCartney thing, it's all about the 6s. And I know that we don't have enough time to ever get into that in this show, but I just want to let the audience know, just trust me that, they're into this magic and they're into their numbers. They're using the number 6, they're using the number 66, and they're using the number 666. All around the Beatles and specifically around the character of Paul McCartney.
Right.
Okay. So what are they doing with that? Well, what they're doing with it is they're using their hexcraft or their magic in order to enchant. And well, what do you mean, Mike? They're enchanting. What they're doing is they're steering the consciousness. They're steering the path of the minds of the population down a certain path in a certain direction. This is what they do. I mean, all this social engineering is all about taking the mass consciousness and walking them down a road you want them to walk down.
Right. Steering.
And this is what they did with the Beatles. And the main cog in that wheel was Paul McCartney. We'll call him Billy Shears, I guess, for lack of what his real surname is. And Billy Shears, the replacement from 1967 on, he was, in my view, a handler inside the band. And he was directing the ship. He was the guy that was in control. And in fact, he'll say in the book, for those folks that want to read the memoirs of Billy Shears, that the entire concept of Sgt. Pepper, everything about the album, everything, not just the songs, but the way the album was put together, the design, the colors. In fact, the entire album is Masonic from A to Z. It was all him.
Right.
It was all him. Yeah.
Right. Okay, so that's the name of the book. It's Memoirs of Billy Shears, yes?
The Memoirs of Billy Shears. Yeah.
The Memoirs of Billy Shears. And if you have seen Sgt. Pepper at all, you know that they introduced Billy Shears in a big musical way. They just flat out say it, introducing Billy Shears. So,
right, the second song, right, with a little help from my friends.
Exactly. Yeah. So the questions that I have, as you guys are kind of walking us through what you think we need to know about this book and the timeline that's put out in this book, are what came to me was, why do you think so many of the other bands feel the need to confess that Paul is dead in their music? Why do you think they all sort of added bits to try to give the game away. Why did everybody have to do that? Number one, okay. And also, many of us, like me, don't, and I'm not immersed in this investigation. It's like you guys are. There was Billy Shepherd. I know you're going to talk about who that ends up being. But then you have this sort of line that goes from a character called Phil Acrell to Vivian Stanshall, British character. I have no idea. I don't know who that is. Mm-hmm. To McCartney. Yeah. So help us sort of know that path as well, if you would.
Did you want to take that, Mark, or you want me to take it?
Well, I can answer the first bit if you like, and I'll leave the Phil Acrell, Vivian Stanshall business to you.
Okay.
So Cara had asked about why we get these clues put out there by the other artists. And of course, the massive array of clues that were put out there through the Beatles albums in terms of audio clues, lyrics, and little inserts and backmasked messages in run-out grooves and that kind of thing. And the pictorial clues as well. On the sleeve of Sgt. Pepper, on the sleeve of Abbey Road, in promotional pictures that were put out of the Beatles. So many of these things seem to be conveying the idea that McCartney has been replaced. It's no longer Paul. And actually, most of the clues convey the idea that Paul is dead. I mentioned earlier that we don't actually have any documentary proof or evidence that Paul is dead, but certainly the clues all point that way. And the reason from my research why clues are put out there in this way is because the controllers of these industries, the occultists that I spoke of earlier, feel the need to communicate to us, the general public, what it is they're doing. And they do it in very cryptic ways, in very symbolic ways. Often it's by way of numbers, often it's by way of very veiled symbolic imagery. But nevertheless, as they see it, they've given us an opportunity to understand what it is they're doing, what they're all about, what the true nature of the situation is. It's known as revelation of the method. Predictive programming also ties into this. It's another facet of it. And it's a favorite tactic of occultists and magicians, sorcerers. They have to let us know what they're doing. If we're too profane or too ignorant or too uninformed to fully understand what they're trying to convey to us, as far as they're concerned, they're off the hook. It's of no consequence that we don't properly understand it. They've done their bit by giving us the opportunity. Now the emphasis is on us. And if we don't act on it or voice any kind of objection or react in any kind of objective way, they see that as a green light for them to go right ahead and do what they were doing without bringing upon themselves the karmic consequences that would ordinarily ensue. As I've said many times before, it's a very sick and twisted way of interpreting how reality works, how free will works. And I would suggest that they've got it very, very flawed. But that, I think, is the mindset of this occult class of elite practitioners that we have. That's why we get all these clues. That's why it was so important for them to place all these indicators in the works of the Beatles, suggesting that Paul is no longer Paul, or I would say telling us that Paul is no longer Paul. That's why I think that whole thing gets done.
Okay, I hadn't thought about that. That's just implied consent, absolutely. Okay.
It's the hijacking of consent as well. That's what they're doing. They're hijacking our consent. But of course, most people, because they never look into this stuff in any substantial way, have no idea that's what's going on.
Okay. So within the context of what we're going to talk about with the book, especially, I personally anyway, need to be sort of walked through these characters a little bit.
Yeah, I think, Cara, also the reason why there's the clues in the songs is that there's a ritual aspect to it also. So as they do this, as they put the clues in the songs, it's ritualistic. So it continues and carries on their magic. So, I mean, that's another piece of it that I believe is why they do what they do. Now, if we talk about Shepherd as an example, we'll call him Billy Shears or Bill Shepherd. He was a session musician going back into the very early 1960s. And in the book, The Memoirs of Billy Shears, he states that his name is William Wallace Shepherd, or Bill Shepherd or William Shepherd. He has several aliases. He's known as Billy Shears, which is the name he used as an alias on Sgt. Pepper. Billy Shepherd. He was Vivian Stanshall of the Bonzo Dog Doodah Band. He was in that band with Neil Innes, who was really one of the main players with the Ruddles, which was a parody band of the Beatles. So just keep that in mind. He was known as Billy Pepper, did a bunch of Mercy Beat albums back in the early days when the Beatles were when they first hit the world stage. So he was doing Mercy Beat albums were essentially knockoff albums where these record labels were they would try to capitalize on the Beatles' fame. So they'd have these bands that, kind of looked like the Beatles and they would sing Beatle music or Beatle-like music. So he was doing that. He was also Phil Ackrell of the Diplomats. And the interesting thing about the Diplomats, which goes back to the early 1960s, he was in that band with Denny Lane. And of course, who was in Wings when he formed Wings? It was his buddy Denny.
Familiar. Yeah.
It's his buddy Denny Lane. Yeah. So they were all in the same club. So the thing with Bill Shepherd is that he takes on many different characters, and he's a very skilled musician. He's formally trained. He can read, write, and score music. Whereas we were told that the Beatles couldn't read music. We were always told that, but Bill Shepherd can read, write, and score music. He's Scottish. He's a direct descendant of William Wallace. That's the character that Mel Gibson played in Braveheart. So he has blue blood, and he's a very high-ranking Mason today. In fact, he was a Freemason when he replaced biological Paul back in 1966. And today, I highly suspect that he is in the illuminated degrees of Masonry, which means that he's above the 33rd degree. He has a very deep understanding of the occult and the esoteric. He's 5 years older than biological Paul. He was born in 1937, whereas Paul was born in 1942. And the most interesting thing about this whole aspect of the memoirs of Billy Shears is that he claims that biological Paul McCartney, the real Paul McCartney, works through him from the other side.
Oh, I see.
Yes, all right. So he's connected with Paul from a spiritual perspective. All right. So a lot of people have a lot of trouble getting their heads wrapped around that, but I'm just explaining what he is saying in the book, The Memoirs of Billy Shears, and this is how he approaches it.
Isn't there a way? I mean, don't people often talk? I mean, Gaga. There's this rumor about Gaga having maybe helps to knock off someone that she used to sing with, and she's got that soul is sort of attached to her. Yeah, that soul is chained to her in a way, and you will every once in a while see a story of her parents begging her to let their daughter go, that kind of thing. So what do you think? I mean, he says he's got Paul. Maybe he does have Paul. I don't know.
Look, anything in this realm, when we're talking about the occult and we're talking about the esoteric magic, I mean, we know what Aleister Crowley was about, right? At least those of us that are listening to the show probably have a fairly decent understanding of who Aleister Crowley was.
Yeah.
I mean, it was all about that. It was all about connecting to unseen forces. It was all about that. It was piercing the veil. So again, in the book, he makes it very clear that he is very much trained and in the know with regard to the esoteric, with the occult, that he is a Freemason. And like I said, he's a very, very high Freemason today. And again, I'll state it again. He's in the illuminated degrees from my perspective. So I don't toss anything out, Cara. Do I think that it's possible that he's engaged that way? Yeah, it could be, because our reality is not what we have been taught and told that it is. We've been basically kept in a small little box about what really goes on with existence and reality. Whereas these folks, especially when they are as developed as they are along the ladder of the secret societies, I mean, they know a whole lot more about how all this works than we will ever know.
Right. Okay. So 1966 arrives. Paul dies. They bring this guy in. He is what Mark calls a lifetime. You guys were calling him a lifetime actor. He's a lifetime actor. He takes over the band, and it's demonstrated probably a million different ways that he's taken over on both in the music and on the cover of Sgt. Pepper, and everything that has anything to do with Sgt. Pepper. Lets the world know, if you have any clue as to Freemasonry or the esoteric sciences in that way, that a new sheriff is in town. Yeah. And then what happens?
You want to take it, Mark?
I'll let you continue, Mike, but I just want to throw in at this point that although you mentioned earlier that Billy Shepherd got the full-time contract to replace Paul, I know that you agree with me on this. There would appear to have been more than one replacement. So if the waters weren't muddied enough already, now we have this additional element, which is, I think most researchers into this area would probably concur, that there has been more than one Four, as they're known. So Four is the name that's been given to the replacement, fake Paul or faux Paul. But although there's been this full-time guy, there would appear to have been a few others that have stepped into the role from time to time as well. And it was the photo montage that you put together, Mike, a while back that really opened my eyes to that. And I've got to say that the more I look into this whole area of research, the more bloody confused and befuddled I become. It's the ultimate mindfuck. It really is. because I've become Paul blind. So I now look at lots and lots of pictures of McCartney, and I can no longer tell whether it's biological Paul, full-time replacement Paul, or one of the part-time Paul. It completely blows my mind. So I thought I would throw that into the mix, because anyone that thinks this is a clear-cut, easy-to-understand area of research, you really have no clue how deep this rabbit hole goes. So I think you would agree with me that there's been more than one Paul.
Oh, absolutely. There's more than one Paul and or fall. That's why I had put the montage together, the collage together, Cara, as Mark had said, because when I was going through this, I said, what happens is we are shown Paul McCartney, the person playing Paul McCartney. It's basically in isolation. We see him on TV or we see him in a magazine, whatever, and we look at him and we say, oh, that's Paul McCartney,
Mm-hmm.
But then when you take the pictures over time and you put them next to each other, this is not the same person going along the timeline. In
Right.
some cases, it is the same person. You can see that they very much look alike. Other times, they don't look anything at all like the picture you just looked at.
Right.
So the way it's explained in the book is that Bill Shepherd has the full-time gig. He has the full-time contract. So he's the guy that most of the time he's playing the character Paul McCartney. But there are times when he's not. And, when are those times? People ask me that all the time. I said, well, perhaps when he was getting a facelift, or he was getting fillers, or perhaps he just needed a break. He just needed a vacation, some time away. And so somebody else filled in from a cameo perspective or whatever. So, but Mark is absolutely right. It's not just, biological Paul, and then all we see from 1966, or we'll say 67, Pepper on, is just Bill Shepherd. That's not the case. It's mostly Bill Shepherd, but there are other times and instances when we're looking at the media, pictures and video, where it's not him, it's somebody else, another lookalike. So going back to what I was saying before, he took over the helm of the Beatles, and he did that by actually meeting with John Lennon, with Brian Epstein, and he explained that in order for him to do this, that he was going to lead the Beatles going forward. And according to the book, Lennon caves in because he's under duress, that his childhood friend, his bandmate, his buddy is dead. And so he just says, fine, you do it. Go knock yourself out. And so from that point on, Bill Shepherd, as Paul McCartney, is the leader of the Beatles. And this is why, even in later years, we see a bunch of goofy stuff going on, where he does a lot of revisionist types of history about the Beatles, about even he wanted to change the credits for the song title, for the song titles, right? So if you had, as an example, we'll pick Sgt. Pepper, where it says Lennon and McCartney. Well, he wrote that song as Paul McCartney. So at one point, a few years back, he was floating the trial balloon to get that switched over to McCartney and Lennon. So A Day in a Life, as an example, was mostly John Lennon, although McCartney or Bill Shepherd wrote the middle part of it. Let's just say it's a Lennon song for the most part. that's okay, Lennon and McCartney, because Lennon was the primary songwriter for A Day in the Life. But anything else, like Let It Be, which was credited as a Paul McCartney song, he wanted to say McCartney and Lennon. So he was doing things like this. So what he was doing, in my view, was he was trying to put in his mind, the proper light on who did what. And this whole thing where it was a joint ventureship, and it was this the story that we've all been sold on over the years, that it was John Lennon and Paul McCartney and John Lennon, it was 50-50 and so on. That ended in 1967 with the release of Sgt. Pepper. It was no longer that.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. In fact, in the book, he even says that he had spent so much time in the studio on Sgt. Pepper and working it that he re-recorded tracks that were recorded by the other Beatles. He erased their tracks, and then he played the instruments, right? He redid the tracks.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of people are going to be like, well, you got to be kidding me. But that's what he states that he did in the book. And so we see this type of behavior. We see a very different character, a very different personality emerge from 1967 on. And if people are really honest with themselves, they should be able to acknowledge the fact that the guy that was doing talk shows and interviews post 1967 to this day is a guy that he comes across as very arrogant.
Yeah.
Right? He's very arrogant. And that's because he, in his mind, and within the secret societies, in other words, within his community of Freemasonry and the Illuminati, he has established himself as a major league player. He was knighted by the Queen twice. I thought it was once, and then Mark told me on a show that we did together that twice. He's been around the block twice with being knighted. Yeah. So that's it. So what happened was this guy, the Beatles became his band, and he was steering the ship. And it's not to say that it was easy for him, because in the book he states that he had a lot of ongoing friction with the other Beatles. Mm-hmm. That he essentially had a love-hate relationship with John Lennon. There were days when Lennon couldn't deal with him and would be nasty toward him, and there were other days when they got on okay.
Yeah.
There was apparently a lot of animosity with George Harrison. We can see that especially during the Let It Be sessions, but even beyond that in the solo career. There's interviews where, especially in the 1980s, where George doesn't have a whole lot of nice things to say about him.
Right.
And this starts to get kind of interesting, because you're thinking to yourself, well, if they were childhood friends, why would you be talking about each other the way you're talking about each other? Why would you be unloading and dumping on each other? You know, I understand that sometimes you have a falling out, but I don't know. Something just didn't smell right. And so when you go back and you take a look at it now.
Sorry to interrupt. I think the other smoking gun there is McCartney's reaction to the news of John Lennon's death.
Oh, yeah.
You can get that video on YouTube. And as you said, these guys were supposed to have been childhood friends that have shared this wonderful, life-changing adventure together. Right. And John Lennon gets taken out in this horrific burst of violence very suddenly. And the reaction from Paul just doesn't ring true for some reason.
As he was chewing gum, Mark.
Yeah.
Right.
He says it's a drag. It's a drag. Oh. And also there's video footage of McCartney, got to put the commas in there, speaking to reporters upon the news of George Harrison's death as well. I think he comes up a country lane in his Range Rover and gets out and speaks to these reporters. And again, looking at that footage, which anyone can get on YouTube, it doesn't ring true to me as an authentic reaction from somebody that has been through this amazing history as part of this group.
In fact, he had like 2 or 3 interviews after that where he tried to put himself in a better light, because he knew when he got interviewed coming out of, I guess, a hotel or some building, that was such a poor performance. Yeah. That later on he went on other shows and he was, throwing softball questions about, how did you really feel when John was assassinated? And then he went into this whole other, kind of persona about how much it was just troubling him, and it was just so destructive to him personally and all that stuff. So yeah, it's really weird.
Yeah.
Hey, how about this David Blaine event? You're familiar with that, right?
No. I'm familiar with it. Yeah, tell the story, Mark.
This David Blaine event in London, Cara, I don't know if you know this one, but this was going back to early 2000s, I think, like 2001, 2002, something like that.
Mhm.
David Blaine was over in the UK. He was doing this endurance stunt where he was being suspended in this glass cube over the River Thames. And
Okay.
there was this big crowd that had gathered beneath him. And a bunch of reporters suddenly realized that in among the crowd was Paul McCartney,
Wow.
who'd come for a night out. And so they
Okay.
approached him to try and get some quotes from him. And they said he appeared drunk and he was very aggressive towards the reporters. And they said, you know, what are you doing here? And he's quoted as having said, I've come out to see this stupid C word, referring to Blaine. And he then got into an altercation with a reporter that tried to take his photograph, and he's said to have started shoving him around. And he then started swearing at everyone in sight, fired his driver on the spot, and then sort of stormed off in a huff. And I think what we were seeing there was a little bit of the true nature of this individual who was probably sick and tired of having to keep up the pretense of being Paul McCartney, the nice guy, all of this stuff, you know. And it was just a little bit of his narcissistic, arrogant, sociopathic nature bleeding through. Maybe he'd had a drink and he was off his guard, but I think that event was quite telling.
I think so too, and I do, you know, all through the narratives that I've heard from you guys about this, I think about the bifurcation of everybody in his life. You know, his children. How did his? I mean, they're just basically already set up to dissociate, aren't they? Living that kind of a lie all the time. Do you know what I mean? It's a very Illuminati, very, do you know, kind of setup that they're already, or that they're born into this thing that they can't, that's an absolute illusion, that there's a crack between reality and public persona. I don't know. Anyway, it's an interesting thing to think about, this having to live with that kind of thing. And I think even the most dedicated psychopath might have a problem after a while. Do you know, this is the kind of thing that you're evidencing here with Paul firing his driver.
Well, I think that's why that's why I think the book was written, and it's because
it's
you know,
confess.
how could you go all this time? I don't care what the benefits are, the material wealth and everything else. You still have this ego, right? And you have written all the songs since 1967, and everybody thinks that a guy that was replaced or died wrote the songs, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so after a while, you start thinking to yourself, well, okay, I'm 80 years old. That's how old he is today. He's 5 years old in a biological Paul. So you're 80 years old. And you know you don't have a lot of runway left. And you're thinking to yourself, well, who the hell's going to know who Bill Shepherd is?
Yeah.
Everybody thinks that Paul McCartney wrote all those songs from 1967 on. Everybody thinks that Paul McCartney wrote Band on the Run, Jet, all those songs, Live and Let Die.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So it's catching up with him. His conscious is catching up with him. Now, I just want to mention one thing, one clue that I'd like to give, offer up, Cara. I actually watched a video on this. If I don't remember who the person was, the YouTube channel, but it was a great analysis. Take a look at Paul McCartney playing bass prior to 1966.
Okay.
He never, ever looks at the fingerboard when he's playing bass. Ever.
Yeah.
Maybe once in a while he might glance down a little bit, but he was so good and he just knew his bass so well. He never had to look down and look at his fingers. Look at Paul McCartney when he plays live, or Bill Shepherd playing Paul McCartney.
Yeah.
When he plays live now, take a look. He always looks at his hands. He's always looking at his hands. Yes. So he may look up a little bit to sing, but then he looks down. And he looks up to sing, and then he looks down. So I can tell you as a musician, when I play guitar, I've been playing guitar a long time. I don't spend my time looking down at my hands because I know where I'm at on the fretboard.
Right.
Occasionally you might look down, right? But for the most part, you don't have to do that. Here we have a situation where we had a musician that didn't look down at his hands on his fingerboard on his guitar. And now what happened? He regressed?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
How can that be, right? So I would ask folks to take a look at that, because to me, that is a very, very important piece to the puzzle. Very important, especially those folks who are musicians. Take a look at that, do that analysis. And I think that you'll see the same things that I saw when I watched that guy's YouTube clip.
Now, can I ask you guys, because right now what we're talking about is what this guy, his state of being on the planet right now after living alive for 50 years and, you know, and being perhaps extraordinarily talented as Billy Shears, but no one's ever going to know that. I mean, this is like a lifetime denied. This is it's an interesting esoteric crime in many, many, many ways, not just against Paul McCartney, but it's a self-inflicted esoteric crime as well against that Billy Shears inflicted on himself by denying his own incarnation in a way. Okay, but what I was thinking was I never had the sense, even if all the Illuminati and clued up types did, that Paul McCartney was the leader of the Beatles. I think the world thought that John Lennon was the leader of that band and never stopped thinking that.
That's what was portrayed to us, that Lennon was the leader of the band, because it started when Lennon was with the Quarrymen way back in the 1950s. And then, Paul McCartney came on board, and then McCartney introduced George Harrison. Mm-hmm. And then they had become, the Silver Beatles, and then they became the Beatles and so on. But that is for public consumption. That's a story that's sold for public consumption. Inside, what was really going on was the guy that was really at the helm was Bill Shepherd, playing the part of Paul McCartney. He was a handler. That's how I look at it. The Beatles always had handlers, but they weren't in the band. They weren't in the band writing the music. So when Shepherd came on board, he was now, integrated into the very fabric of the songwriting as a handler that was part of the four guys now.
Right. So another thing, though, I'm just curious about this. Ringo Starr's the only one who didn't have some sort of assassination attempt perpetrated against him, right? Why was Lennon shot then? What was going on there? George Harrison, didn't he have at least one attempt at killing him with a knife?
Yeah, in his Friar Park. Yeah, his Friar Park estate, yeah.
Yeah, so is that wrapped? It's got to be wrapped up in this, guys. It's got to have something to do with this.
We'll let Mark take that, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, there's all kinds of theories as to why John Lennon was taken out. He certainly had become a thorn in the side of the establishment of his day, particularly the Nixon administration that had tried to get him deported from the US many times. Yeah. He was an anti-war activist and civil rights activist and stuff, and he was obviously upsetting some very powerful people with his messages. And I certainly think that Lennon is somebody that went off script in his post-Beatles years. I think when he was a part of the Beatles, he was very controlled. He did what was required of him. It wouldn't surprise me if he was under mind control. When he hooked up with Yoko Ono, many researchers think that she was some kind of mind control handler, and that wouldn't surprise me at all. But then you've got the interesting paradox of him coming out with all this amazingly conscious music in his solo years and making all these incredibly powerful statements and spiritual statements through his solo music. So, that's just an enigma in its own right. It wouldn't surprise me if him being taken out was connected in some way to the McCartney replacement. Maybe it was some method of damage limitation. Same thing with George. So you had this guy that broke into his Friar Park home in Henley-on-Thames in, I think it was the night before New Year's Eve, 1999. And he was badly stabbed. This assailant kind of had this altercation with him on the stairs, and George was badly stabbed up, went into hospital. He was dead within 2 years. He died in late 2001. And it was pretty much that attack that killed him. He succumbed to cancer, but, he was a goner from that point on. So again, it wouldn't surprise me if that attack was intended to take him out in 1999, and it may well have been connected to knowledge of the McCartney affair. I think Ringo is somebody that has played the game, that knows how to keep his head down. And certainly in more recent years, you've seen this apparent strong friendship between McCartney and Ringo. So when the 8 Days a Week film came out, the Ron Hardy film recently, you had McCartney and Ringo doing interviews together, reminiscing on the old days.
Which is so weird to see them together.
Because Paul wasn't there in the early days.
He was making it up.
About all these Beatles memories, which he doesn't actually have. So that's crazy. And you've got this story that has been floating around for so long now, where Ringo is supposed to have come out and admitted that McCartney was replaced. And
I keep seeing that.
Yeah, and it's a fake story.
Is it a fake story?
Through the Hollywood Inquirer. And everyone keeps quoting it as if, oh my God, here's revelation at last from Ringo that this thing took place. And I think that is an exercise in disinformation that was deliberately put out there to make researchers such as us look a bit crazy and a bit stupid when it can be shown to be a hoax story.
Right.
But there was a genuine interview in 2011 where Ringo spoke to the UK's Daily Mail. And during the course of the interview, he says twice, "I'm the last remaining Beatle."
And
What a
it's true.
strange thing to say. If
It
Paul
is.
is around, why
It
would
is.
Ringo say, "I'm the last remaining Beatle"? So that's a genuine story, which kind of has gone under the radar of most people.
Okay, we've only got about 5 minutes, so I'm going to throw in one word. Heather.
Heathergate.
Heather. No, Heather, the one that was married to.
Yeah,
Heather
yeah.
Mills. Yeah.
Oh, Heather Gate. Is that what you said? Heather Gate?
Yeah.
Heathergate, yeah.
Oh, I didn't
Well,
realize it had one of those already. Okay, Heather Gate.
Let me just say that when this life of mine is over, and the day when I get to leave my body and go wherever it is I'm going next, if I have the opportunity to be omniscient and know everything there is to know, the first question that I will ask is, was Paul replaced and who was he? Because this whole thing perplexes me so much. That is one mystery above all others that I want answered. And if there was one wish that I could have fulfilled in this lifetime, it would be to get hold of Heather Mills's box of evidence.
Yeah, the box.
That's all I want to say.
The black box.
I want that
Scott,
box.
The box, right? So what's the story, guys? People don't know Heather Gate necessarily.
Well, I'll give you my perspective on it real quick.
Uh-huh.
I think there's one of two scenarios with Heather Mills. It's either that she didn't know when she married him, and then she found out. Okay, so that's one scenario. The other scenario is that she did know when they got married, and she used her knowledge or knowing that he was an imposter as leverage against him when the marriage went south. Because there were a lot of stories about them battling all the time. They were fighting all the time.
Yeah.
So those are the two scenarios. So either way, that whole thing that went down, Heather Mills either did know or eventually found out that he is not Paul McCartney, that she was married to Bill Shepherd.
Yeah, and I keep saying, do you think that's what happened? I think, that's probably, I don't know.
I think she discovered it wasn't Paul. She married the guy thinking he was. That seems the most plausible scenario to me.
Yeah, I don't think he would have married somebody who already was in the know. I mean, if he had married somebody who was already in the know, then she would have been part of the game, and they'd probably still be married.
Well, Linda knew. Linda Eastman.
Linda knew. Linda was his handler, yeah? Linda was a handler, was she not? This is what I'm reading.
I don't know. I mean, she comes from a very wealthy family, and so the story goes in Nick Collestrom's book that she had said to him, he had taken a fancy to her, and one thing led to another, and she said, "Well, I know who you are, and I know who you are not," because Linda Eastman was taking a lot of photographs of bands and artists and so on. That's what she was doing. So, and the Beatles were in that, they were in that portfolio of pictures that she was taking. So, in my view, he had children with her, 3 kids plus, the oldest that was child was with her. That was right. He adopted, I think. And so, look, you just don't have that kind of life with those, 4 children. I think it's 4 or 5, and your spouse is just unknowing. So she definitely knew.
She knew. Now, the one thing I want to say before we wrap it up is that Paul McCartney kind of looks like he's melting right now, doesn't he? Does he not? I mean, it's just kind of too much plastic surgery, I guess, huh?
All the stuff all the fillers and everything else now is just it can't. The skin has lost its elasticity, right? So it's all starting to sag now. And if you take a look at pictures of him today, you take a look at pictures of him when he was Vivian Stanshall, before Viv Stanshall had the surgery actually changed him. He's starting to look more and more like what Bill Shepherd actually looks like.
Okay. All right. So let's make sure we do this. Mike, what do you want them to know about how to get a hold of you, how to see your stuff?
All you need to do is go to my hub website. It's Sage of Quay, Quay, sageofquay.com. And from there, you can go to my radio shows, my blog, Twitter, Mixcloud, and all that stuff. So very simple. Yep. One-stop shop. Yep.
And you can listen to him talk about guitars, too. If you're into guitars, that's your one-stop shopping for being into guitars. I'll tell you that right now. Okay, Mark, what do you want them to know about you?
Well, Cara, let me just very quickly make a couple of points before we go off. I know we're limited in time, but I just wanted to make the point that this whole McCartney replacement could not have taken place without the full complicity of military intelligence and other aspects of the establishment. The police, the judiciary, MI6 or MI5, sorry, the British intelligence agency that are supposed to vet anyone that comes into contact with the royal family. So the Queen knighted McCartney in 1997, there would have to have been a full background check done on the guy. So even if it had been possible for this switch to have taken place in the 60s and for it to have gone under the radar, that is the point at which it should have been discovered that there are some anomalies and he's not necessarily who we're told he is.
Right.
So it just smacks to me of the whole thing being a military intelligence operation, and any kind of scrutiny that would ordinarily have been applied to this guy has been negated because that's who's in charge of this show.
Right.
The other point I wanted to make is that I would not be surprised if we get disclosure about this whole replacement affair when this guy, Shepard 4, dies. So he's 80 years of age. How long has he got? 10,
Right.
15 years tops.
Yeah.
This is a personal opinion. Many others may well disagree, but I'm thinking of what we got with the Jimmy Savile affair, where we only found out about his true nature after he had died. And there have been a whole bunch of paedophile British MPs and lords we've only found out about after they've died in terms of what they were really into. So I would not be surprised if we get this shock headline in a few years after Fall has passed that states, oh my God, we've just realized that this wasn't Paul McCartney. Because it goes back to the revelation of the method, telling us what they're doing, but they also protect their own. So they only let this stuff go out when they can no longer answer for it. That's just personally how I feel about it.
But the good news, Mark, is you and I will be prophets.
You will.
Well, we'll be sages.
Yes.
You're already a sage.
You're sage. Thank you, guys.
Yeah,
Thank you for coming.
you had asked me about my information.
Yes,
The one-stop shop is markdevlin.co.uk. My book, Musical Truth, is out. It's available on Amazon. You can also go to musicaltruthbook.com. And Volume 2 will be out early in the new year. So
early in the new year, so we're going to be having you guys back at that point, right? Everybody's going to read Mark's book, and then we're going to come back and talk about that, right?
Well, that would be good.
Yeah, that would be good. Okay. All right, you guys, thank you for coming. It'll be up sometime tomorrow, and you're beautiful, beautiful people who do really clean, really good, really deep research. And I appreciate that about you. I really, really do. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Carol.
Okay, bye-bye.